All right, today we're going to talk pollination, fertilization, and germination. Mostly pollination, but we'll talk the other two as well. This would be a good definition to write down. The movement of pollen from the stamen to the pistil is called pollination. Movement of pollen from the stamen to the pistil. The stamen is the male part. The pistil is the female part. So we're moving pollen from the stamen to the pistil, from the boy part to the girl part. Pollen contains sperm. If you remember from previous chapters, the sperm is trying to get to the egg. So the pollen, which contains the sperm, is going from the male part to the female part, which has the egg. That is pollination. Pollination can occur in two ways. You better write this. If I'm going too fast, you can always pause. Pollination can occur in two ways. The first, pollen is carried by animals from plant to plant. Pollen is carried by animals from plant to plant. Most of the time, insects. I would write this down. Bright petals and distinctive scents attract animals that feed on pollen or nectar. So, plants that use insects for pollination usually have pretty flowers, smelly flowers, bright colored flowers. And that's going to attract the insects to pollinate them. Now, a lot of plants, a lot of flowers will produce this sugary juice liquid called nectar. Nectar is, it's like orange juice, apple juice. It's very sugary, and most insects love it. So it produces that nectar, and the insect comes to drink the nectar, and when it does, that pollen, which is sticky, will stick to the insect. So let's say we're talking about a bee, okay? That bee is going to come drink the nectar, and when it does that, the pollen's going to stick to it. Then it's going to go to another flower of the same species. It's going to drink nectar there. Some of that sticky pollen will then rub off on the second plant. So without knowing, it's taking the sperm from one plant to the other. It's pollinating it. Okay, I have a friend not too long ago who needed some help moving a refrigerator. Now, he knew if he called me and said, hey, can you come over and help me with the refrigerator? I might say, ooh, I'm kind of busy. But instead, he called me and said, hey, I ordered some pizza. You want to come over? So I came over, and while I was there eating pizza, then he's like, hey, I need you to help me move this fridge. Okay, well, that's kind of what plants are doing to insects to get them to pollinate. Hey, I got this good nectar here. Why don't you come get some? Oh, by the way, why don't you carry this pollen for me? I'd probably write this down also. Usually an insect or bird will only eat from one type of plant. So most insects have a specific species of plant that they're going to pollinate. They're not going to go from like an orchid to a rose, because orchids and roses can't reproduce together. That'd be, you know, like a dog and a monkey having a baby. It can't happen. So most insects and birds, like hummingbirds, are going to pollinate one type of plant. Okay, like we just said, you don't need to write anything. As animals move from one plant to another, they carry pollen. It's sticky with them. Some of the pollen may be rubbed off onto the pistil of the next plant. What if animals weren't around to carry pollen? The second way pollination can happen, I'd write this down as pollen can be carried by the wind from one plant to the next. Pollen can be carried by the wind from one plant to the next. So, some plants don't rely on insects, instead they rely on the wind. Now, this can only work if there's a few factors here. Go ahead and write this down. This can only happen if a plant produces lots of pollen, if the plant is located in a windy environment, and if the plants are located close to each other. So go ahead and write all those down. If you can shorten it up, great. But a perfect example of a plant that uses the wind for pollination is corn. Okay? I don't know how many of you guys have ever walked into a cornfield in July, but there's pollen everywhere, like yellow dust clouds of pollen. Okay? If you have allergies, it's a nightmare. But you walk through corn, and if you just bump into a plant, there will be this cloud of pollen. It makes tons and tons of pollen. And the wind, in South Dakota especially, we get wind, is going to blow it around. So instead of an insect carrying pollen to a specific spot, plants are going to basically just give off tons and tons of pollen. The wind is going to blow it around, and some of it is going to accidentally land where it's supposed to. A lot of it will be wasted. It'll fall to the ground. It'll blow away, whatever. But if it makes a ton of it, some of it's bound to go where it needs to be. Another example, evergreen trees do the same thing. Just produce tons and tons of pollen. The wind takes it. Okay, remember, evergreen trees, gymnosperms, do not have flowers. So they rely on the wind. I kind of think of an example. If you're playing dodgeball, and let's say your team has 10 players left, and the other team has 1. Now, if you're on the smart team, you might all count to 3, 1, 2, 3, and on the count of 3, everyone throws the ball at the one remaining player. Okay, well, that's kind of what wind pollination is like. You don't need to write anything. This method of pollination relies on luck. The pollen just happens to fall onto the pistil of the same type of plant. I do want you to write this down. Pollination is taking pollen, which contains sperm, from the stamen, the boy part, to the pistil, the female part, where the egg is. Fertilization is where the sperm and egg combine. So fertilization, the combination of sperm and egg. Remember that whole 23 chromosomes of sperm, 23 chromosomes of egg when we were talking about humans? Well, it's back. This is fertilization. You don't need to write this, but fertilization process is the same for angiosperms and gymnosperms, so whether you have a flower or not, it's the same. One last thing here, germination, the sprouting of a seed. So maybe you've accidentally germinated a seed before. But let's say you have a corn seed and it gets wet. Okay, it'll start germinating, it'll start sprouting, it'll shoot a little root out, it'll shoot a little stem out, and it'll begin growing. Those are the notes.